What if one of hell's most feared kings was never a monster at all, but once a god of wisdom and sovereignty? Imagine the desert wind carrying the sound of trumpets and drums, a regal procession moving across the sand, banners lifting in the heat, and at the center a crowned figure radiating presence. His followers called him guide, teacher, king. Later, he would be renamed Paimon, recast as demon, placed in the grimoires of fear. But what if that was not his truth? What if the demon you were warned against was only a mask placed over something too dangerous to be left unclaimed? Paimon, or Palin, as whispered in variant traditions, appears in the Ars Goetia as one of the kings of hell, commanding legions, demanding respect, arriving with music and heraldry. To the church, this image was proof of pride, corruption, rebellion. But look deeper. The music is not chaos, it is ceremony. The crown is not arrogance, it is sovereignty. The knowledge he offers is not deception, it is forbidden wisdom. Every detail inverted, every symbol recoded, until what was once guide became corrupter. What was once king became enemy. This is the haunting question. Was Paimon ever demon? Or was he God demonized? What truths were buried when his name was blackened, his sigil forbidden, his archetype feared? And more importantly, what part of yourself was buried with him? For every king cast down reflects sovereignty exiled within. To speak his name, to trace his seal, to hear his music, is to risk remembering that you were never meant to be servant, but sovereign. To understand why King Paimon or Palin in variant ecos was demonized, we must step inside the architecture of evil itself. For the truth is that demons are not discovered. They are manufactured. They are built by systems of power that cannot tolerate ambiguity, sovereignty, or forbidden wisdom. And Paimon, with his regal procession and aura of kingship, represented everything the architecture needed to suppress. In the beginning, spirits were not bound in hierarchies of heaven and hell. They were daimons, intermediaries between mortal and divine, teachers, protectors, voices that whispered intuition. Across cultures, figures like Paimon embodied knowledge, order, and sovereignty of the mind. The music that announced him was not seduction, but ceremony. The crown he wore, not blasphemy, but symbol of authority rooted in wisdom. But as monotheism spread, as empires sought singular authority, multiplicity became danger. Sovereignty had to be centralized in God alone, mediated by the church alone. Every rival presence had to be demonized. Thus began the inversion. Gods of fertility became devils of lust. Goddesses of autonomy became succubi of death. Kings of wisdom became tyrants of hell. The architecture of evil was constructed brick by brick through redefinition, until every independent spirit was recast as enemy. In this scheme, Paimon was too powerful to erase, so he was inverted. His knowledge became deceit, his sovereignty became arrogance, his music became temptation. His very name was preserved but rebranded, placed in the Ars Goetia as proof of the infernal order. To fear him was to obey the architecture. This architecture thrived because it colonized not only lands, but imaginations. People were taught that to hear a voice within was to risk possession. To seek knowledge outside the church was to traffic with demons. To claim sovereignty of mind was to consort with kings of hell. Every act of independence was framed as pact with darkness. The architecture thus maintained obedience not through chains, but through narratives. It convinced souls to exile their own fragments, to fear their own power, to sign contracts of obedience willingly. Paimon's image was central to this mechanism. Unlike chaotic spirits, he appeared regal, precise, ordered. He arrived with music, with heralds, with clarity. In other words, he embodied what the system feared most. The idea that sovereignty and knowledge could be organized without church, without God, without empire. To demonize him was to demonize the very possibility of independent kingship. His figure reminded humans of their capacity to rule their own minds, and so he was chained in symbol, sealed in grimoires, his image twisted into corruption. But the architecture did not stop at myth. It used ritual. Exorcisms reinforced the binary. Priest as savior, Paimon as corrupter. Sermons painted him as proud king cast down, warning against curiosity and rebellion. Even art weaponized his symbols, turning regal crowns into horns, processions into grotesque parades. Each image engraved fear deeper, ensuring no one would dare claim the archetype within. The architecture thrives by externalizing shadow, and Paimon became masked for sovereignty exiled. This is why the Ars Goetia itself is paradoxical. To those within the architecture, it is proof of hell's legions. To those who see deeper, it is a map of human psyche. Paimon's placement as king reflects not just hierarchy of spirits, but hierarchy of archetypes. He embodies sovereignty, knowledge, ceremony, the very qualities inverted into sin. To engage with his sigil is to engage with those fragments. To fear him is to fear yourself. The architecture wins either way by banishment or by blind summoning. Both reinforce the mask. The brilliance of the system is that it made humans police themselves. Even without priest, the architecture lives inside, a voice that says, "Do not think too much." That is heresy. Do not claim too much. That is pride. Do not desire too much. That is corruption. These whispers are not divine law, but echoes of colonization. They are the inner bars of the prison. Paimon was demonized so thoroughly that even curiosity about him feels dangerous. The architecture installed the lock inside your own mind, and yet the cracks are visible. When you look at his image and see not chaos but order, not arrogance but sovereignty, not temptation but ceremony, you glimpse the lie. The architecture shakes because its foundation is inversion, not truth. To awaken is to recognize that the demonization of Paimon was not revelation but strategy. It was never about saving souls, it was about harvesting obedience. This is the architecture of evil, a grand edifice built on fear, inversion, and exile. It has stood for centuries, convincing humanity to fear its own kingship, to banish its own wisdom, to kneel before external authority. And Paimon's name sits at its center, a reminder of sovereignty inverted, a king recast as devil. But once you see the blueprint, the prison no longer holds. For the architecture only survives if you believe its story, and belief once shattered cannot be rebuilt. Symbols are not decorations, they are spells. They speak directly to the unconscious, bypassing reason, shaping perception without permission. And when it comes to King Paimon, the architecture of evil relied heavily on symbols to transform his archetype of wisdom and sovereignty into a mask of fear. To see his sigil, his crown, his procession, is to witness the battle of meaning between what he was and what he was made to be. Begin with his sigil, one of the most striking in the Ars Goetia. At first glance, it seems abstract. Lines, circles, curves, intersecting like fragments of geometry. To the untrained, it is nothing. To the adept, it is a psychic circuit, a key to contact. But to the system, it was a threat. The sigil is not chaos, it is order. It encodes sovereignty of the mind, precision of thought, clarity of will. That is why it was forbidden. It's not because it summoned monsters, but because it revealed fragments of self that the architecture wanted exiled. To trace the sigil is to dare to remember. His crown is another symbol, one of the most consistent across accounts. In procession, Paimon appears crowned, accompanied by trumpets and music. To the ancients, a crown signified authority rooted in wisdom and ceremony. But within demonology, the crown became arrogance, pride, corruption. What once meant sovereignty was inverted into sin. The symbol did not change. The meaning was recoded. The architecture ensured that every glimpse of a crown triggered suspicion, not reverence. The music that announces him is perhaps the most haunting symbol of all. Drums, trumpets, choirs accompany his arrival, suggesting not chaos but ritual precision, not seduction but ceremony. In cultures across time, music opens gateways, binds communities, lifts consciousness. For Paimon, music is not lure, but language, procession of sound that mirrors the procession of thought. Yet in demonology, it became noise of temptation, siren call of corruption. Once again, symbol inverted, meaning twisted. Even his regal procession followers, banners, order was reframed. 5. To see a king arrive in dignity should inspire awe. To demonize it is to teach that sovereignty itself is dangerous. The very structure of his imagery was too close to earthly kingship, too close to power that could rival empire or church. So his procession was painted as grotesque carnival, his heralds as mockery, his presence as prideful excess. What was once archetype of rightful rule was rewritten as warning against ambition. But the language of symbols extends beyond the Goetia's pages. In art and film, Paimon's sigil reappears as cursed mark, his name whispered in terror, his crown turned into horns. Modern media amplifies the same inversion. A recent horror film depicted his cult as grotesque, his presence as possession. Audiences screamed, hearts raced, contracts renewed. The symbol of sovereignty had been hijacked again, deployed as trigger of fear. Most never question the script, they simply bleed energy into the architecture, reaffirming shadow as enemy. And yet, symbols remain double-edged. They can enslave, but they can also liberate. To those who dare to look differently, the sigil of Paimon is not curse, but key. The crown is not arrogance, but reminder of sovereignty waiting to be reclaimed. The music is not temptation, but alignment, rhythm of thought and will. The procession is not mockery, but ceremony of the self returning whole. To reinterpret symbols is to invert the inversion, to reclaim fragments stolen by fear. This is why mystics and occultists always worked with symbols directly. They understood that the architecture operates by freezing symbols into singular meanings, always negative, always forbidden. To break that freeze is to shatter chains. A serpent can be sin or wisdom. Horns can be devil or vitality. A crown can be pride or sovereignty. The choice of meaning is the true battleground. And the architecture fears nothing more than a human who chooses differently. Look around. Symbols still dominate our world. Logos of corporations, flags of nations, emblems of religions, all are sigils binding loyalty, commanding energy. We march beneath banners, chant before emblems, kneel before icons without questioning. The system speaks fluent symbolism. We are taught illiteracy. Demonology is only one chapter of this larger story, a war over who writes the dictionary of images. Paimon's crown was rewritten as pride because the architecture could not allow it to remain sovereignty. Awakening means becoming literate again, to look at a symbol and ask, who wrote this meaning? Who benefits from my reaction? What shadow of myself hides behind this mask? When you see Paimon's sigil and feel fear, you are under spell. When you see it and feel recognition, you are breaking it. The difference is not in the lines of ink, but in the story attached. The forbidden truth is this: symbols are mirrors. They show what is already within. Paimon's sigil reflects sovereignty of mind. His crown reflects dignity of self-rule. His music reflects harmony of thought. His procession reflects wholeness of fragments returning. The system cannot erase these truths, so it inverts them. It paints mirror as mask, reflection as monster. But once you know, the spell falters. So the question is, when you see the symbols of Paimon, the seal, the crown, the music, the regal procession, will you see pride and corruption, or will you see sovereignty waiting to be claimed? The answer determines whether you remain bound by the architecture, or step outside it, literate again in the forbidden language of symbols. Blood has always been the hidden current running beneath demonology, and in the case of King Paimon, the pattern is no different. From witch trials to whispered pacts, from ancestral guilt to the crimson ink of ritual. Blood, literal and metaphorical, has been the oldest currency by which the architecture of evil sustains itself. To understand why Paimon was demonized, one must understand how his name became a vessel for this economy of sacrifice. In the medieval imagination, every encounter with demons required offering. To summon a spirit like Paimon, the grimoires prescribe incense, words, perhaps even drops of blood. The magician believed this was transaction knowledge for offering service for sacrifice. But beneath the ritual lies a universal law. Energy must be exchanged. The system took this law and weaponized it, convincing humanity that their blood was demanded constantly, not only in ritual, but in life itself. The Inquisition spilled oceans of blood in the name of purging demons. Women accused of witchcraft were bound, burned, their screams rising as offerings disguised as purification. Each execution was not only literal sacrifice, but symbolic one. The community bled fear, shame, obedience. The victim's blood stained earth, But the true harvest was the collective energy drained from those who watched, trembling, vowing never to consort with shadow again. Paimon, like many other spirits, became scapegoat in this economy. His name invoked to justify violence, his archetype fueling ritual slaughter. Yet blood need not be visible to flow. Emotional blood is subtler and far more abundant. Every time desire is framed as demonic lust, a person bleeds shame. Every time sovereignty is condemned as arrogance, they bleed confidence. Every time curiosity is punished as heresy, they bleed vitality. This hidden bleeding is constant, invisible, and far more profitable for the system than pyres and swords. The architecture does not need to kill when it can drain quietly day by day through inverted moral codes. For Paimon, blood is linked with inheritance. Generational contracts bind families not only by belief, but by guilt carried in bloodlines. The sins of the father, the shame of the mother, the vows of the ancestors, all transmitted like spiritual DNA. Children inherit not only physical blood, but emotional debt. They grow beneath weight of warnings. Do not speak that name. Do not question too deeply. Do not step outside the circle. The architecture ensures that every drop of inherited fear flows upward, feeding the same edifice that first demonized sovereignty. The spectacle of blood is also maintained through culture. Horror films depicting Paimon and his cult where blood sacrifice seals pacts, where crimson stains walls are more than entertainment. They are modern rituals, reinforcing the association. Paimon equals blood. Demons equal death. Sovereignty equals corruption. Audiences scream, pulse quickens, fear bleeds. The film becomes altered, the screen chalice, the ritual renewed. Once again, the blood is not literal, but emotional, extracted in mass ceremony, disguised as fiction. But blood, whether spilled or repressed, carries a paradox. It is both life force and offering. That is why the system covets. It is pure energy, condensed vitality. Wars fought in the name of God, heretics slaughtered. Witches executed, all are framed as necessary to protect humanity from demons. Yet in truth, they are massive harvests of blood. And the demon archetypes serve as masks, blamed for the sacrifice that feeds the very architecture condemning them. Paimon did not demand this blood, the system invoked his name to drink it. Awakening means seeing this economy for what it is, not eternal law, but engineered harvest. Once you realize that shame is blood, fear is blood, guilt is blood, you can choose where to spend it. You cannot stop bleeding. Life itself is sacrifice, but you can consecrate it differently. To feel desire consciously is to spend blood on creation, not shame. To claim sovereignty proudly is to spend blood on freedom, not obedience. To seek knowledge fearlessly is to spend blood on awakening, not repression. The currency remains, but the account changes hands. Paimon, demonized king of sovereignty, becomes symbol of this reclamation. To approach him not as monster, but as mirror is to renegotiate how your blood flows. Will you continue bleeding unconsciously into a system that thrives on fear? Or will you consecrate it as offering to your own wholeness? The choice is forbidden because it is powerful. It bankrupts the architecture. It starves the edifice. Transforms blood from tax into crown. History shows the price of forgetting. Every drop spilled in his name was never demanded by him, but by those who feared what he represented. Blood became weapon to exile sovereignty, to erase wisdom, to chain humanity in obedience. But blood also remains key. For the moment you reclaim it, your shame, your fear, your guilt, you cut off the system's harvest. You stop paying rent in blood to an architecture built on lies. So ask yourself, whose altar does your blood feed? Whose system does your shame sustain? Whose architecture does your fear nourish? And what would happen if, for the first time, you refused to pay in the currency of obedience and instead crowned yourself sovereign? Spending your blood on freedom? That is the question Paimon leaves behind, whispered through centuries of demonization. Not will you bleed, but who will you bleed for? If blood is the currency, then contracts are the instruments by which it is exchanged, measured, and bound. The story of King Paimon cannot be told without seeing how his image was woven into the logic of pacts, both explicit in ritual and invisible in the fabric of human life. For the architecture of evil does not rely only on violence. It thrives because people sign themselves away, line after line, vow after vow, In contracts they barely realize exist. In the grimoires, Paimon appears not only as a king but as a ruler who demands respect, offerings, even signatures of allegiance. To summon him, magicians were told to draw his sigil, burn incense, speak the words with precision, and be prepared to offer something in return. This appears simple. A magician makes a request, and Paimon, commanding his legions, responds. The pact is exchanged knowledge or service for offering. But beneath the literal rite lies symbolic truth. Contracts are everywhere. Every human being, knowingly or not, enters into them. The Goetia ritual is only a dramatization of the deeper law. Think of the ancestral pacts whispered in bloodlines, families bound to silence, generations carrying vows of obedience or fear. Never speak of what you saw, never question the church, never honor the old gods. These are not parchment contracts sealed with wax. They're invisible contracts sealed with survival. A grandmother's silence, a father's submission, a child's shame, each is signature, binding future generations. Paimon, as archetype of sovereignty and wisdom, becomes symbol of what was signed away. The architecture ensures his name stands as warning. Do not break the pact. Do not reclaim the crown. Religious contracts are the most explicit. Baptism is presented as cleansing, but it is also covenant, marking the soul as belonging to authority outside itself. Confession renews the contract. Each admission of sin is a clause signed against sovereignty. To kneel is to sign. To repeat prayers is to sign. These are not gestures of devotion, but acts of binding. The demon is blamed for temptation, but the true pact is with the system that defines temptation in the first place. Even trauma writes contracts. A child who expresses curiosity and is punished signs a vow. I will not question again. A teenager whose desire is shamed signs. I will bury this fire forever. These vows linger for decades, hidden but binding. Shadow becomes demon, not because it ever was, but because the contract demands exile. When adults later dream of kings with crowns or hear music in the dark, they recoil not from the archetype itself, but from the terms they once agreed to under duress. Paimon becomes the mask for their own signatures. Exorcisms reveal the cruel irony. Presented as liberation from demonic pacts, they are in fact contract renewals. The priest chants, the crowd trembles, the subject writhes, and at the climax, the community proclaims its allegiance again. To church, to dogma, to fear. The supposed pact with demon is broken, but a deeper one is reforged with the architecture. The harvest continues, the system thrives, and the mask of Paimon serves its purpose once more. Modern life offers subtler contracts. Click, I agree to terms you never read. Sign mortgages binding decades of labor. Accept corporate loyalty in exchange for wages. Swear allegiance to flags, nations, ideologies. Each contract extracts fragments, time, energy, sovereignty. These are the Goetia pacts of the digital age. No incense is burned, no sigil drawn, but the essence is identical. Obedience traded for security. Fragments of self traded for belonging. Paimon is invoked not in name but in structure, symbol of what it means to trade sovereignty for comfort. The question is not whether contracts exist, but whether you are conscious of them. For awakening means realizing that contracts can be revoked. The architecture insists they are eternal, once baptized, always bound, once damned, never free. But this is propaganda. A contract exists only while consent endures. The moment you see it for what it is, the signature fades. The demon ceases to haunt because it was never capture it, was the clause you agreed to unconsciously. Paimon's image terrifies not because he enslaves, but because he reminds you of the agreements you made in fear. To integrate him is to renegotiate. To stand before his sigil and say, I no longer exile sovereignty, I claim it. That is the forbidden pact, not with demon or church, but with self. To acknowledge shadow, to sign covenant with your own fragments, to declare that no authority outside may bind what was always yours. This is why Paimon is king, because his archetype is not about servitude, but about rule, not over others, but over mind, will, and soul. Every mystic who dared break contracts was branded heretic. He refused to kneel, to confess, to repeat the words. They tore invisible covenants, reclaimed fragments, walked whole. And always, They were punished, not for consorting with demons, but for refusing the architecture. For daring to say, I revoke, no longer agree. So ask yourself, how many contracts have you signed in silence? How many vows of fear still bind you? What would happen if you dared to rip them, to refuse to sign anew with yourself? The answer is why Paimon was demonized. It's not because he demanded contracts, but because he revealed you could write your own. Every architecture of control thrives on a single trick: invert the natural order. Twist virtue into sin, paint sovereignty as corruption, and label curiosity as blasphemy. This is the inverted moral code, and in the story of King Paimon, it becomes painfully clear. His very symbols, crown, music, wisdom, were not erased but flipped, ensuring that what once elevated humanity became chains of fear. Consider sovereignty first. In every culture, kingship is not just political power, but archetypal energy. The ability to rule oneself, to stand sovereign, to create order from within. Paimon, described in the Ars Goetia as arriving with music and majesty, embodies this archetype of regal presence. Yet under the inverted code, sovereignty becomes arrogance. To stand tall becomes to sin. To rule oneself becomes rebellion against God. The system does not destroy sovereignty, it rebrands it as demonic pride. And thus, every instinct toward autonomy triggers shame, fear, and obedience. Now, look at knowledge. Paimon is often associated with teaching, revealing secrets, granting hidden wisdom. In a world where knowledge liberates, this archetype is dangerous. So, the architecture flips it. Knowledge becomes deception. Curiosity becomes heresy. To ask questions is to invite demons. To seek beyond doctrine is to consort with spirits of hell. The serpent in Eden, offering knowledge, is recast as corrupter. Paimon, king of wisdom, becomes deceiver. Under this code, ignorance is sanctified as faith and wisdom condemned as sin. Desire follows the same inversion. Passion is the fire that fuels life, creation, intimacy, art. In older pantheons, gods of fertility and desire were revered. But in the architecture of fear, desire is recoded as lust, temptation, corruption. Paimon's ceremonial music, which might once have aligned soul and body, becomes noise of seduction. His regal procession becomes parade of vanity. The architecture ensures that what was once sacred vitality is now doorway to damnation. The ceremony of Paimon music, banners, orderies, depicted in demonology as grotesque, excessive, sinister. Ritual precision becomes proof of diabolical manipulation. Yet in truth, these rituals mirror order, harmony, integration. The inversion guarantees that when humans encounter their own impulse for order and ceremony, they fear it as satanic. The brilliance of the inverted code is that it traps humanity in double bind. If you suppress sovereignty, desire, and curiosity, you bleed vitality into the system. If you indulge them, you bleed guilt and shame. Either way, energy flows upward. The system does not care which path you take, only that you remain bound by inversion. Sovereignty becomes pride, knowledge becomes heresy, desire becomes sin. And each inversion ensures obedience. This inversion also colonizes symbols. The crown, once sign of rightful authority, becomes an icon of arrogance. Music, once language of transcendence, becomes a lure of hell. The sigil, once key to psychic circuit, becomes cursed mark. Every detail of Paimon's presence is inverted, so that even the thought of him triggers fear. Humans need not meet him to be bound. The inverted code ensures they exile fragments of themselves automatically. Jung would call this shadow projection. What you repress becomes demon. Architecture institutionalized projection, turning it into mass religion. The shadow is not just personal, but collective. Paimon's demonization is not about his reality, it is about humanity's refusal to face sovereignty, knowledge, and desire within themselves. By inverting the code, the system guaranteed the shadow remained external, feared, and endlessly fertile for harvest. Awakening begins when you question the inversion. You ask, is sovereignty really pride, or is it sacred? Is knowledge really heresy, or is it liberation? Is desire really corruption, or is it vitality? Invert the inversion is to reclaim what was stolen. To see Paimon not as deceiver, but as teacher, not as arrogant king, but as sovereign guide. It's not as corrupter, but as archetype of dignity that is forbidden act, because it unravels the architecture. But this reclamation is not easy. The inverted code has been etched into language, art, ritual for centuries. Even to speak his name aloud may feel like trespass. Even to look at his sigil may stir unease. That is the proof of the spell's power. You do not fear Paimon, fear the archetype of sovereignty inside you. And that fear was planted, cultivated, inverted into chains. The forbidden truth is this: Paimon was never proof of corruption. He was proof of potential. His demonization reflects not his fall, but ours our willingness to believe inversion, to exile fragments, to call our own dignity sin. The inverted moral code thrives only while unquestioned. The moment you challenge it, its logic collapses. What was pride becomes sovereignty. What was heresy becomes wisdom. What was lust becomes sacred fire. So ask yourself, how many times have you called your curiosity rebellion? How many times have you named your desire corruption? How many times have you bowed in shame before your own sovereignty? And what would happen if, for once, you refused the inversion, reclaiming these fragments as holy? That is the question the architecture fears most. And that is why Paimon, crowned and musical, was painted demon, where he embodied the virtues the system could not allow, virtues only you can reclaim. Rituals are the nervous system of the architecture. They do not only exist in grimoires and temples. They surround us, repeat through our daily lives, disguising themselves as religion, entertainment, politics. Even habits so ordinary we no longer notice them. And when it comes to King Paimon, the rituals that sustain his demonization are everywhere woven into the fabric of culture to ensure his archetype of sovereignty remains chained. Take the Goetic ritual itself. The magician is instructed to draw Paimon's sigil, construct a circle, burn incense, and pronounce his name with precision. Trumpets and drums are said to herald his arrival. To the uninitiated, this looks like dangerous summoning. To the system, it is useful theater. Each time such a ritual is feared, condemned, or sensationalized, it reinforces the idea that Paimon is an external threat, not an archetype within. The ritual functions whether or not he appears. The real appearance is in the mind fear. Oh, trembling obedience. That is the energy harvested. Exorcisms serve as inverted rituals of the same kind. A priest places hand on forehead, chants prayers, commands the demon to leave. The body writhes, the audience gasps, the crowd prays harder. On the surface, the ritual is expulsion, but beneath, it is reinforcement. Every exorcism renews the binary: priest versus demon, authority versus rebellion, system versus shadow. Even if Paimon's name is not spoken, his archetype as sovereign king hovers in the background, reaffirmed as enemy. Church liturgy itself is ritual against sovereignty. Kneeling, confessing, repeating words dictated by authority, each act is ceremony of submission. Week after week, these rituals carve grooves in the psyche. Obedience is safety. Questioning is danger. Autonomy is pride. The architecture does not need Paimon's sigil on the wall. It needs only the shape of his archetype inverted and enacted, over and over, until humans forget that sovereignty was ever theirs. But rituals are not limited to religion. Consider how horror films have portrayed Paimon in recent years as grotesque monarch, commanding cults, demanding blood. Audiences watch in darkened theaters, their bodies tense, their hearts pounding. The fear is real, the energy potent. Whether viewers believe or not, they participate in ritual. The screen becomes altar, the film script incantation, the audience congregation. By the end, the archetype of sovereignty is once again bound in chains of terror. The ritual works without incense or sigils. The cinema itself is summoning circle. Politics functions through rituals just as insidious. Leaders frame opponents as demons, threats to order. Crowds chant names, wave banners, repeat slogans like prayers. The architecture is always known. Repetition is invocation. Mass participation is liturgy. The figure of the demon shifts masks from Paimon to political enemy, but the ritual is identical. Fear is raised, shadow projected, sovereignty surrendered to external authority. The archetype of kingship is demonized again in modern clothes. Even the digital age is saturated with rituals. Memes of Paimon's sigil circulate online, half in jest, half in dread. Viral posts about summoning demons spread, each share a micro-incantation, each laugh a nervous offering. Algorithms amplify what provokes strongest reactions: fear, outrage, disgust. In this sense, the algorithm is the new priest, ensuring that rituals of fear repeat endlessly, feeding the architecture with every click. The smartphone becomes grimoire, the scroll an unending incantation, the viral symbol the sigil that seals the pact. And yet rituals need not enslave. They are engines, not prisons. The architecture has hijacked them, but they can be rewritten. Imagine lighting a candle, not to banish Paimon, but to welcome the sovereignty he embodies. Imagine tracing his sigil, not in fear, but as meditation on your own kingship of mind. Imagine hearing his music, not as seduction, but as rhythm aligning your thoughts. Such rituals invert the inversion, reclaiming energy for integration instead of obedience. Mystics have always known this. They crafted private ceremonies in defiance of dogma, whispered invocations to reclaim shadow, meditations to face demons as mirrors, sigils drawn as affirmations of inner wholeness. These acts were dangerous not because they summoned external forces, but because they broke the architecture's monopoly on ritual. To re-script the ceremony is to cut off the harvest. That is why heretics were burned not for calling demons, but for refusing to participate in the architecture's rituals of obedience. So ask yourself, how many rituals do you perform daily without knowing? Every time you kneel, laugh at a demon meme, chant a slogan, confess a desire, you are participating? Who benefits from your performance? Who drinks the energy your body releases? The forbidden truth is this: you cannot escape ritual. You can only choose whose ritual you are performing. To awaken is not to flee ritual, but to see it, to claim it, to re-script it. The moment you realize the architecture has choreographed your gestures, you can break the choreography. You can write new ceremonies, light new candles, draw new sigils. You can perform rituals of integration, where shadow is embraced, sovereignty reclaimed, and fear no longer harvested. Paimon's presence then changes meaning, no longer king of hell, but reminder that rituals can enslave or liberate. For rituals are everywhere. They are in churches and screens, memes and chants, candles and contracts. They will not disappear. The question is whether you will keep performing theirs or begin, at last, to write your own. Awakening does not arrive like lightning from the sky. It is quieter, stranger, like a mirror slowly clearing a fog, until you see a face you were told never to recognize. To awaken to the system is to realize that the demonized king you feared, Paimon, crowned monarch of the Goetia, was never an enemy, but the fragment of sovereignty you signed away under the architecture's contracts. And now he waits not outside in the shadows, but inside, in the halls of your own mind. The first step in awakening is recognition. You begin to see how the architecture of evil was built, not on truth, but on inversion. You notice how sovereignty was recoded as pride, knowledge as heresy, desire as corruption. You realize that the crown placed on Paimon's head is your crown, inverted into horns. The music that heralds him is the rhythm of your own thoughts, twisted into temptation. To awaken is to see that the demon you feared was the king within, exiled by stories that were never yours. The second step is grief. For awakening exposes how much blood has already been spent. You grieve the moments you bowed when you could have stood tall, the times you silenced your questions out of fear of heresy, the desires you buried because you were told they were demonic. You grieve not only your own fragments, but generations who lived under the inverted code: parents, grandparents, ancestors, bound by ancestral contracts of silence. Their blood fed the system, and their sovereignty was buried with names like Paimon. Awakening begins with mourning what was stolen, but grief gives way to rebellion. Once you see the contract, you cannot unsee it. The sermons, the exorcisms, the horror films, the memsal reveal themselves as rituals of programming, and you begin to refuse. You stop signing with your silence. You stop kneeling to symbols recoded as threats. You dare to trace Paimon's sigil not as curse but as key. You whisper his name not in fear but in defiance. Each refusal tears a clause from the contract. Each act of reclamation loosens the architecture's grip. Yet rebellion alone is not enough. Integration is the heart of awakening. For if you simply invert the inversion, you risk pride in place of obedience, indulgence in place of repression. True awakening comes when you sit with the shadow, face the demonized archetype, and recognize yourself. You tell Paimon, "You are not my jailer. You are my sovereignty. I reclaim you." You allow the fragment back into the whole. The demon dissolves, the king stands revealed, and for the first time, you feel the weight of your own crown. Integration means rewriting rituals. No longer repeating those of fear, you craft ceremonies of wholeness. Lighting a candle to welcome shadow. Drawing sigils as affirmations of sovereignty. Listening to music as alignment, not temptation. Each act is small, but each rewrites the script. Ritual ceases to be theft and becomes creation. You no longer bleed unconsciously. You consecrate blood as offering to your own becoming. The architecture trembles, for it cannot harvest what is consciously given. Awakening also means solitude. The herd survives on shared rituals of obedience. To step out is to risk exile. Friends may call you dangerous, family may whisper heresy, institutions may brand you corrupted. But solitude is not loss, it is sovereignty. Better to stand whole in shadow than fractured in false light. It's better to wear your own crown, even if alone, than to kneel beneath a borrowed one. This is the path of awakening. The courage to bear solitude until sovereignty becomes community again. Not through fear, but through integration. The final stage of awakening is vision. You begin to see the system not as eternal, but as fragile, dependent entirely on belief. You realize that the architecture of evil has no walls, only mirrors. Break the mirrors, and you walk free. You recognize that demons never hunted you. They were fragments exiled by your own consent. Paimon was never king of hell. He was king of your mind, waiting for you to return. Awakening is not liberation from demons, but liberation of demons, which is to say, liberation of yourself. This is the forbidden truth. You were never victim, only participant. You signed the contracts, repeated the rituals, obeyed the inversion, but you can refuse, revoke, rewrite. Awakening is the act of tearing down the architecture, not with fire, but with sight. Once you see, the spell falters. Once you reclaim, the harvest ends. Once you integrate, the king returns. So the question lingers. Will you remain inside the architecture, bleeding into rituals not your own? Or will you awaken, reclaim the crown, and walk sovereign again? For Paimon is not enemy. He is the mirror. The only terror left is whether you dare to meet his gaze. Perhaps Paimon was never a monster, but the sovereign you were told to fear. His sigil, his crown, his music, they are fragments of yourself, waiting to return. The mirror is before you. Will you turn away, or dare to meet his gaze? Comment below, and subscribe. The descent continues.